it's been another day of extreme volatility on global stock markets. And in the last 48 hours, France, more than most, has been at the mercy of huge swings. Shares in French banks were hammered over fears to overexposure to bad debt before they clawed back some of the losses this afternoon. Well, President Sarkozy is back in Paris doing all he can to reassure investors that his government is on course to cut the deficit. Italy has been doing the same thing. But if France suffers, so does the Eurozone, because France and Germany are, after all, the frontline defenders of the common currency. Sarkozy and German Chancellor Angela Merkel are set to meet next week. But is it enough to reassure investors? Or have markets simply lost all confidence in the European project? And is that scepticism justified? Well, joining me tonight in London, Ambrose Evans-Pritchard is the international business editor for the British newspaper The Telegraph. By satellite from Brussels, we're joined by Sony Kapoor. He's the managing director of the think tank Redefine. In Italy tonight, Fabrizio Coricelli is a professor of economics at the Paris School of Economics. And last but certainly not least, here in the studio with me is Philippe Dalvizanet. He's an associate professor of economics at the Paris University, the Sorbonne. Philippe, I'll start with you. Does France deserve this hammering it's been taking in the markets?
Well, I don't want to take a kind of nationalistic posture. I don't have nothing to do with that. But when you compare things, I think it's a bit exaggerated for several reasons I could develop if you want me to.
Please do. Go ahead.
Okay. One of them, of course, and if you take a difference with the US, for instance, is that the two things, maybe we could add some more. One is, if the target is to stabilize the debt ratio, that can be discussed. But if the target is so, suppose so for the sake of the argument, you need to decrease the so-called primary surplus, primary deficit, which is the deficit ex interest payment, to a certain level. Okay? The path to do between where we are today regarding this primary deficit in the US vis-à-vis what should be done, the path that has to be made in the UK vis-à-vis what should be done is much higher than what it is in France. Of course, I don't compare with Germany because they are already with a surplus and stabilized. But the more important things that I should say is that there was this gossip rumor regarding the rating of France. France will be downgraded in the coming days or weeks or whatever. All the three rating agencies said, that's not what we have in mind. We keep in mind a stable rating.
All right.
Okay. The reason why, and I will finish with that, is not the situation today, is the fact that there is a path. And this path will be credible. I could explain why. We don't know in the US who will be...
You mean Sarkozy has a credible plan? He said this is how much I'm going to reduce the deficit
by. The more you
say
you have a credible plan, the more you put yourself in a trap. Because if you miss, this guy was not able to. So the thing is credible. And moreover, the two main, one of the two that will be a candidate on the Socialist Party, either Hollande or Aubry, thanks to this crisis maybe, they now accept the idea that the deficit should be shrunk.
All right, let's put that to Ambrose Evans-Pritchard in London. Does France deserve all of this doubt in the market at the moment?
Well, the problem is that once S&P had downgraded the United States from AAA, they pretty much have to do the same thing to countries in Europe in similar conditions. That probably includes France and Britain. The French debt is a very, very similar level to the US debt, and S&P included all the US Social Security pension liabilities in its calculations. And if it does that for France, I'm afraid France is in a very similar situation. And everybody here knows that whatever the rating agencies are making pro forma comments at the moment, they're simply saying that nothing's changed. Well, what else can they say? It doesn't mean that they will not downgrade these countries, both France, Britain, and maybe others ultimately. They may well do so, and that's what's sort of hanging over the markets, because the whole EFSF rescue fund for Southern Europe essentially hinges upon this AAA rating. And if that goes, people will start to doubt the credibility of the rescue fund and really whether they can uphold the system.
Right, Sonia Kapoor, because France, countries that don't have a AAA rating will not be allowed to contribute to this fund, which is being set up to bail out countries such as Greece when their economies fail.
Well, that's not strictly true. Other countries do contribute, but the AAA countries
it's more expensive to contribute.
Slightly. The reasoning is that because Europe has strong reputational concerns, for example, that was one of the reasons why it didn't want to go to the IMF in the first place, it decided to set up a fund seeking a AAA rating, having been a big critic of the rating agency. So the whole structure of the EFSF was designed primarily with the purpose of having a AAA rating, which was not strictly needed. And now, having locked themselves into this position, the EU countries find themselves in a very vulnerable position where if there is a downgrade, then it doesn't just impact the country that is downgraded, for example, France, but it affects the EFSF, and that is seriously problematic. But just taking a step back, I do not think that France deserved the kind of punishment it came for and with the markets. And there are two reasons for that. One is that the decision-making process in France, the politics is presidential, and which means that the president can and has the capacity to make strong decisions, which is not the same case in the United States. So to be very clear, S&P downgraded the United States not because it doubted its capacity to service its debt, but because it doubted its willingness to service its debt. And that is very different from France. France will not willingly default on its debt. And I do not think that the credit situation in France is so bad that it will have to default. So in that sense, this was widely exaggerated. That having been said, what is different, what goes against France is that France already has a very large size of government, more than 50% of the economy, which means the scope for any additional taxation is rather limited. And that's different in the United States, where the government is still quite small. So if the United States did get into trouble, it could significantly ramp up taxes, at least in theory.
Now, Fabrizio Corricelli, I'll put that to you. Is the fact that France has this huge commitment to the European Stability Fund making things worse in terms of the credibility of its ability to pay back its debts?
Well, yes. There is, first of all, a quantity problem. If the European Financial Stability Fund is going to be used on a large scale, of course, this will imply that a country like France will have an increase of its own debt. Estimates are that at the current 440 billion amounts of the fund, if that is used fully, France will have an increase of its own debt of around almost 90 billion euro, which means more than 4% of GDP. So there is an accounting problem, is that the debt of France will increase if the European Financial Stability Fund will be used. And actually there are talks of increasing the amount, even doubling it. So that's one issue that I think has to be taken into account, that weakens the prospects for debt reduction of a country like France. Although I believe that this is not per se should not justify concern about the debt sustainability of France. It's just that under the current market uncertainty and panic in the market, it's obvious that everybody is looking for any sign of something that could be wrong, could go wrong. And so if the government is coming with an objective of stabilizing the debt by 2013 or 14, then critics could say, well, you know, this is not realistic because the use of the European Financial Stability Fund will actually go against that.
Right, the markets are particularly sensitive this month, aren't they? And any rumour or any sign of bad news is sending them a lot further. But I just wanted to throw in a figure here. If you look at last year's figures, the budget deficit for France is 7% of GDP. Now, only Spain, Greece, Ireland and Portugal, and we all know what happened to them, have a higher number. So France is next in line, one would assume.
Yeah, except that there is a trend that we news that we have over the first months of the year put us well in line to achieve the objective for this year, which is 5.7. We might even, as last year, have a slight surprise on the good side on 4.6% for next year. So there is no dispute in a parliament with a minority to pass a program, and riots that, what we saw in Greece some time ago, that pushed people to say, well, Greece won't adopt a new adjustment program. Now we have the same in the UK. We will see. But this kind of thing happened, and all depends on the, as one of our colleagues say, how the political process works. On the one hand, when he compared the US with here,
because we've got elections in 9 months' time. Let's not forget.
And second, you have election, but if you have a consensus regarding the debt, I mean, if the opposition today in France said, "Oh, we don't care about that, let's spend," people wouldn't take them seriously, because there is now, I wouldn't have said that 3 months ago, there is, it seems, when you look at polls, in awareness of the severity of the situation, a majority of people consider this is an important issue. Probably a few months ago it would have been something else. And now politicians are in a position to have things passed. That's why probably tomorrow there will be a disappointment. Probably you will see, according to INSEE, Bank of France and others, growth in France for the second quarter will be disappointing. So we will have a lot of comments. So it's not good news for the deficit. But if there is a commitment to offset that by new measures, and if there is a consensus for that.
So we're depending on the politicians quite heavily. Ambrose Pritchard-Evans in London, do you think that austerity is what the markets want right now? Because we've seen austerity plan after austerity plan in Italy, in France and elsewhere. But the markets are still tanking.
The market's already switched. It regards these austerity policies as inherently potentially dangerous in themselves, because it's creating a sort of self-feeding downward spiral, rather like the way the gold standard worked in the early 1930s. All the burden of adjustment is falling on the weaker countries. That's unworkable over time. And I would say there's a bigger issue behind all this than whether France meets certain deficit requirements or loses a AAA. There's a feeling here that the EFSF is not nearly big enough to deal with the threat. Basically, the city view is it needs to be 2 trillion euros of actual lending power, 4 times the current size. You know, it's basically got 300 billion left to do the job for Spain and Italy, if necessary. That's not nearly enough. And the question in everybody's minds here is, will Germany backstop the system? Will the Bundestag support raising the EFSF to 2 trillion and committing German taxpayer money to this project? That's what's on everybody's minds. It's existential.
Sonia Kapoor, what are your thoughts on that? Taxpayers in Germany, can we expect them to pay much more towards bailing out other countries in Europe?
Well, part of the problem is that there's a path dependence. Every time a country's borrowing rates have reached a certain high, that becomes the benchmark for how risky that country is. So the end goal of whether Germany agrees to backstop the EFSF or not is important, but equally important is the process by which we get there. And that's been consistently observed since the start of the crisis, that eventually the governments have got their act together, but it's always been too late, where we end up with the worst of both worlds, where they are actually making progress, they are actually contributing funds, they have improved the EFSF, but it always comes too late, and the market having spiked, that becomes the benchmark for what's going to happen next. And this way we are caught in a spiral, which is only going to lead to disaster. I think we are going to end up with eventually one of 2 or 3 corner solutions. One would be if the ECB came and didn't say that, well, we have been pushed into buying Spanish and Italian bonds and we might do it for a little while, but came in with a strong open-ended commitment which said, we are committed to buying bonds of Italy and Spain and any other country that gets into trouble to the extent it takes to get the interest cost down to reasonable levels. Now, that is a credible commitment, and by which the markets would not dare short those bonds, for example, because you can get caught in a short squeeze and you can solve the problem. And that means that if that commitment is made, then the ECB will presumably not need to buy so many bonds. But making a half-hearted commitment is actually the worst possible strategy. Or the other corner solution could be that despite all the opposition to the idea of Eurobonds, things become so bad that that becomes the only possible way out. So I think one way or the other, given how badly our leaders have performed thus far, they have significantly amplified the cost of the crisis. We will end up with one of these two corner solutions or a combination of the two.
Too little, too late from European leaders, Sony saying there.
Well, I quite nearly totally agree with what has just been said. I mean, as we say in the market, we have been often behind the curve. And we knew from the start that, I mean, in the economics profession, being against or in favor of a euro, we all knew that something was missing, which was some kind of fiscal federalism, whatever. Mr. Ising in the FT yesterday reminded that. So Eurobond might be one of what he called a corner solution. The thing is,
this is the European Central Bank.
I mean, you have you have an
debt.
agency that kind of issues bonds on behalf of everybody. So you create a kind of bond market the size of the US Treasury. So you have more liquidity, a lot of things that are positive. So you have a kind of mitigation of the credit risk. But that can only be credible with a lot of rule and a lot of loss of sovereignty. But if it is a fiscal federation, why not? Because if a country that wants to misbehave and will have a neighbor paying, that's why we had the stability pact that didn't work, but that was the idea at the beginning. So you need to have something, what Mr. Trichet maybe called the European Minister of Finance, I don't know, that is in control of budget. Is that politically possible? That's another story, because in the US, a state, California, Florida, whatever, it's not the federal government. The federal government can decide increasing taxes, I mean, maybe decreasing or increasing expenditure. Now you still have different countries, and this power to change taxes and expenditure are decentralized. This is the big difference.
All right.
And that makes the Eurobond, it can just work with a lot of loss of sovereignty, because you need a kind of thing that is central, that controls the countries, because as we have seen, they're not, politicians are not always very efficient.
All right, well, we definitely, we're going to talk more about whether there's an appetite in the Eurozone for deeper political union. Maybe that's the solution, maybe it's not, maybe it's the opposite. We'll be discussing that after the break. We're going to take a short pause. When we come back, we'll have the international headlines for you as well. Don't go away.